Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is Jill Danello from Green Education US, and we are pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Sustainable Markets for Sustainable Materials. This webinar is part of the 2021 series, Discovering the Sweep Standard. You can view previous webinars from 2020 and 2021 on both the greeneducation.us and Sweep Standard websites. With us today is Professor Hulls and Rob Watson. Professor Hulls will be presenting first on the sustainable markets, and then Rob will discuss the connection to the sweep standard. Professor Hulls, we know that you are an adjunct professor at Santa Monica College, that you have been advocating for sustainability and environmental protection at all levels of government for several decades. You're the CEO of the Sustainable Environment Management Company. And honestly, you're involved in so much, I don't think I can list it all here today. So as I turn the controls over to you, I'd really like for you to share what are the most exciting things that you're working on and what's going on here.
All right, well, thank you very much, Jill, and thank you, Rob, and everybody else that's attending today. It's indeed my pleasure to be here and to talk about sustainable markets. And as Jill had mentioned, we're going to talk about the current state of recovered material markets, kind of look at the analytics. We're going to provide a prognosis of what we see for the future in sustainable systems for material recovery. And we'll take a look at how SWEEP, and Rob will be able to talk at quite length about how SWEEP supports the development of sustainable materials markets. And then we'll also take a look at preparing for continued job growth in sustainable materials management, what we might call building local wealth. I'd just like to mention too that besides my decades of work, now it's 50 years that I've been in this industry, and kind of got my start working at a recycling center at Long Beach State University in Long Beach, California. And that's where I got to understand a little bit about markets and what you had to do in order to prepare things for marketing. And then also we have Rob Watson, a SWEEP founder and president, and he's the principal of Upland Road Advisors, LLC, and he's an international leader in market transformation in green buildings. And we know him affectionately as the founding father of LEED, the largest and fastest growing international standard by which green buildings are measured. And I did not know that Thomas Friedman, the famous author, called Rob one of the best environmental minds in America, but I know that by virtue of how much time I've been able to have the opportunity to spend with Rob. Just a real quick background on what is SWEEP. That stands for Solid Waste Environmental Excellence Performance SWEEP standard. And we talk about it as a market transformation standard, which is looking, you might say, not at the source, but looking at how we manage our residuals in society. So we target municipalities and the waste and recycling management service providers, and we identify and reward leaders in sustainable materials management. We also are attempting to define a very distinct roadmap to evaluate comprehensive policies and calculate achievement metrics. And sometimes these metrics have to be really improved and substantiated. And we do that as well as provide performance benchmarks for sustainable waste collection, recovery, and disposal practices and technology. And we are a national nonprofit organization. Also, at the bottom of a lot of the slides, you'll see an email that if you have any specific questions later at a different time, you can always send an email that can be received by SWEEP at info@sweepstandard.org. Now, who is SWEEP and who are the committee members? Because we're a membership organization that depends on people's both really depends on their voluntary efforts to help create this national standard. The This particular slide shows some of the notable members of SWEEP and our wonderful participants in our national and our various technical committees. And if any listener is or viewer is interested in developing the national SMM standard, literally from the ground up, because we really do love a grassroots approach, we're interested in you joining our group. To kind of get into the, you might say, the real information about markets, well, I'm going to start with a markets primer because I'm a professor, of course, at a local university, and I tend to approach things in a very specific manner. But really, what is recycling? And I start with that just because it's like a lot of folks think of recycling as another aspect of solid waste management. Well, it's not really solid waste management. It's really been an economic necessity for a lot of folks. And in fact, I recall a quote from a former mayor of LA in which he rose to power in LA on the basis of we don't need to recycle in the United States because that's why we fought wars, so that we could control our own destiny. We're not poor anymore, so we don't need to recycle. Of course, that's not really the premise or purpose really of recycling, but the idea is that it's always been part of life. And we see in some of the pictures on this particular slide, some of the activities that people have done over the years, sorting materials, bringing back bottles, here's a shot of a lady and a child and the cat recycling. So even cats recycle. Okay, so kind of interesting. But today it's mostly identified with recycling centers and curbside collection from homes and commerce in our cities. Now, really interestingly, in World War II, the recycling industry was considered a very essential industry, and recycling was about 40% of our GDP, gross domestic product. Today, it's less than a half of a percent. But really, the importance of that is that World War II was a time of strife and industrial development to support the war effort, and so we recycled a ton. It doesn't mean, however, that we're recycling less today, okay, because of the drop in percentages. It's just that we waste so much more today. And there's another aspect here as well, in that recycling is really not a waste management activity. It's a economic activity that today has become integrated with our residual management system, in other words, sanitation. So let's put, I think, municipal recycling really in perspective. Municipal solid waste on this slide here, I say MSW, represents about 450 million tons. The source of that is the Waste Business Journal that's collected annually. So when we take a look at all the waste that we produce in this country, municipal solid waste, which most people are familiar with because they see the trash trucks, they're handling their own materials, they're rolling carts out to the curb and such. But MSW is really less than 3% of overall waste in this country. We got mining, construction, wastewater, energy production, agriculture, and much more. And they all contribute towards about 20 billion tons of waste per year. Now, the thing about it is that, okay, that's the stuff that you don't really see and you're not really cognizant of. But we see this in terms of what we do put out at the curb and what we put out at our businesses and stuff, But the thing about MSW being very valuable is that it's already been refined. So the idea here is that we don't have to start from scratch, okay? Like an aluminum can recycling takes only 5% of the energy originally used to smelt aluminum bauxite and manufacture cans from scratch. So that's why I call it urban ore. Now, recycling is not a small industry. It's not something to sneeze at, but, you have to, again, put things in perspective. Recycling is a $110 billion industry. Our burn and bury industry is about 65 billion. That's taking residuals, putting them in landfills or incinerators. But as a perspective, packaging is a $1 trillion industry, and the total gross domestic product in the United States, last time I checked, was about $23 trillion. So we can see that we're part of, but not a major part of our economy right now. There are two aspects that I do want to stress about end users, because collecting and sorting and preparing for markets, who are those markets? Who is it that's going to use the material on a major scale? There's two segments. There's the secondary materials industry, what we often call salvaging or the scrap sector, and that tends to be kind of small, a smaller part of our overall industry. That's that, the a paper mill that's dedicated to the use of recycled material. The primary materials industry, though, that's where most of the material gets actually used. So the glass industry, for example, takes in a small amount of recycled glass, which they call cullet, so that they can meet technical and environmental, you might say, specifications. And so there's always this need to use a certain amount of secondary material. So used commodities are used to a much greater extent in the primary materials industry. Overall, about 69 million tons is recycled back into the technical nutrient cycle. These are products and materials that we create, from both organic and inorganic material. There's another 25 million tons that's recycled back into the biological nutrient cycle. Both those cycles are very important, especially the soil cycle, because we do need to reinstate the organic carbon content of our soil. Overall, our national recycling rate is about 32%. That's on a EPA percentage basis, but it actually is probably a lot lower than that if we're looking at our 450 million tons, maybe closer to less than 20%. Corrugated cardboard is our number one recycled material, which I have in a screen off to the right-hand side. These are the major materials that are recycled within the United States today. Interestingly, after corrugated boxes, it's composting. Composting is our next major category of recycled material. Now, in terms of an analysis, there's three aspects in this particular slide that I wanted to call your attention to. One is that we've witnessed a lot of profound changes in markets of recovered materials over the years, and some in the past are not so important anymore, but but these things are indeed having a major impact on us. One aspect is that in many of our states, we have legislated diversion targets. In other words, we must recycle, quote unquote, recycle a certain amount of material or certain materials. This is all about increasing supply. You must set aside your organics. You must set aside your paper and cans and bottles, and those are going to be collected. So across the country, we have a lot more curbside collection, recycling systems, and commercial recycling systems being developed. One thing that has changed over the years is how sorted, segregated, or separated the material is. And what we see mostly in the United States today is what we call single stream. Just commingle everything into one container. And often what happens in a lot of communities is people wish something could be recycled. And so if they think it might be recyclable, they put it in the recycling bin. And what happens is that we have ended up with a poorly segregated or separated material stream. And in the past decade or so, we've sent almost 50% of that supply to foreign markets. And as a change, now many of these foreign markets don't need our supply today. like China's sword. So we don't have enough domestic procurement or closing the loop industries, because a lot of our industries have gone overseas, and we've lost a lot of manufacturing capacity within the United States. So that has seen a major change in our recovered material market. Now we're also have complications caused by the pandemic. Not only is recycling deemed not essential in many areas, but recycling requires a lot more human intervention. That's why recycling and reuse and reduce and programs of that nature actually create a lot of jobs, because we need more human intervention than simply picking it up in a 10-ton truck and taking it down and squishing it into a hole in the ground with a bulldozer. And then finally, a great portion of the issue is laid at the door of the linear economy. As I said, the recycling industry, 110 billion out of 23 trillion dollars. It's not a major part of our economy. And we continue to have a lot more reliance on externalizing our final disposal costs, as I show in the little graphic on the right-hand side. The linear economy, take resources, make them into new products, consume them, and then we have residuals. And a lot of the upstream activity is just simply on what kind of corporate opportunities there are to make money. And consumer choice. We have more choice than we could ever imagine. If we probably went back 100 years, people would just be astounded at the amount of choice that we have. The flip side of that is the consumer and municipal burden for all the residuals. And that, of course, is something that SWEEP is attempting to deal with, as well as going upstream. But we definitely need to focus on the fact that we don't have a national materials management policy. So our prognosis is that we have bad and good news. Raw resources continue to depress our secondary materials market. I just read an article the other day, plastics, which is derived from oil, petroleum. Petroleum is depressed price, so the cost of manufacturing new plastics, new polymers, is a lot less than the cost of extracting plastic and being able to make it available for recycling. Technically, 90% of waste is recyclable, but economically it's much less, because of that cost of extraction. But fortunately, there's some happy faces. Pricing is going up. And the fact that we don't ship far means that we do have, in some cases, less transportation costs. Although, interestingly enough, the cost of shipping overseas is actually a little bit less than railing from like California to Arizona, for instance. And I think one thing that's really good is that more communities are emphasizing procurement. And really, by the numbers, the 5 major private haulers in waste and recycling reported earlier this year that revenues are definitely increasing. And so I want to show you a slide here real quick. Curbside material prices are recovering. This shows you in the blue 2020 and in 2021 in the orange. And you can see all across the board, prices are increasing. And you can go to resourcerecycling.com and be able to get this information as well. Are continuing the prognosis, sustainable material systems have to be part of a circular economy. We have to get away from the linear economy. Markets are not isolated from the mainstream. We do need to address fossil fuel and the oil economy. I think of a former president said we were hooked on oil, and we do need to get off of that. I think one thing that's very exciting is that the fastest growing and second largest material category of recycling by tonnage is composting. And organics are required purchases now in every California community, or at least by January of 2022, 0.08 ton per capita per year. So what do we need to do? A lot more. In fact, I think we have a golden opportunity at the national level for infrastructural new Green Deal funds. They need to be focused on local recycling industries. Perhaps California's model of organics procurement and embodied in SB 1383 could be promoted on a national basis. We do need to have a lot more I think, local distributed recycling networks that operate just like distributed energy. And the spigot of wastefulness really needs to be curbed, and more businesses need to understand how to monetize conservation. So long as raw resources are subsidized and cheap, no externalities included, then recycling will be depressed. This is just a quick chart showing how some organizations, Zero Waste USA, for example, have viewed the opportunities that are present to create jobs. Landfilling versus recycling, processing versus manufacturing. And obviously, anytime there's value added, there's greater opportunities for jobs. And I just wanted to, as a last item here, I've been recycling since Earth Day 1970. I got my introduction to markets about that time. I've been working with SWEEP for a couple of years. The effort has definitely been stellar, and really a sustainable materials management standard embodied by SWEEP should be built in every single community, helping us to get to a national consensus standard. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Rob. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. This will stop. Screen. Do you want to continue?
I've taken care of it. Don't worry about it.
Got it.
Thanks so much, John
Thank
Michael.
you.
I really appreciate your working with us and your 5 decades of wisdom and experience has been super helpful in helping SWEEP not only define its mission, but refine its content. SWEEP would not exist but for the dedication and volunteer spirit that you and the others have given to the standard. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you all today, and thanks so much to greeneducation.us for supporting this webinar series and being our partner. We are in the process of developing a training and accreditation series, which will be hosted here on greeneducation.us. So stay tuned for materials and trainings around SWEEP accreditation for professionals, which is distinct from the certification of entities. So, as Professor Hulls mentioned, we are looking to support market transformation through combining regulatory push with market pull. SWEEP's role in this is the market pull piece as opposed to the regulatory push. But what we've found is that there can be a virtuous cycle between a voluntary standard like SWEEP and setting up mandatory goals either at the local or national level for recycling, sustainable materials management, safety, et cetera. So we hope to contribute to that and create a framework for market-based approaches to sustainable materials management. And one of those key elements is promoting an adequate material recovery infrastructure, not only for what we traditionally consider to be, quote, recyclables, but moving more extensively into organics, which have a very vital climate impact component to them, as well as materials that are currently considered, quote, non-recyclable, but if they were able to be aggregated in sufficient volume and collected and delivered to manufacturing infrastructure at an appropriate cost, are technically recyclable, but right now there are barriers in the market and the structure that prevent that. And what we hope to do is to create incentives so that that kind of local processing infrastructure can be put in place and that people are rewarded and recognized for doing so. And then, one of the, all markets are governed by supply and demand, and both those elements are strongly influenced by both the quality and the quantity of these materials. Obviously, when quality goes up, price goes up. Sometimes when price goes up, compared to alternatives, then demand can go down. But if we were, for example, at the societal level to decide to price carbon, and not subsidize the extraction of virgin materials, then we could have actually a true accounting of the environmental impact of materials management, manufacturing, et cetera. And that would, I believe, make the scales more balanced going forward, and certainly have significant rewards for the future. So SWEEP, it has 5 performance categories. We sort of start with a policy foundation, looking to create a framework and something that both local governments and businesses can be held accountable to. And so that sustainable materials management policy framework gets a lot of credit initially because we're new, and not a lot of people have necessarily been doing things along this line. So we want to start sort of with the basics and then become more emphasizing the actual supply chain activity and the recording of actual achievement as the standard gets more experience and traction in the market. We also look strongly at getting people to look at the instrumentality of demand through waste generation and the very, very important market leverage of preventing waste in the first place, either through reuse or reduction or other ways of preventing waste, which have been shown to be among the most effective environmental strategies in this sector. And then we get into sort of the supply chain, if you will, of the materials management industry, where we start with collection, move into recovery, and ultimately disposal. As you might imagine, the market elements are focused on the policy area and the post-collection recovery area. So at the end of the day, we're trying to promote sustainable materials management and get the highest and best use of materials and reduce the overall generation of waste through programs and policies adopted by governments and industry. So it's important to know that you have to pursue sustainable material management market practices if you want to certify to SWEEP. In the overall standard, we have 2 prerequisites, which is sort of like you must be at least this tall to get on this ride. And then we have 6 credits representing 17 points in the 100-point system. We expect that aspect of the system will grow. Part of the challenge right now is that we are, in a very frothy period of transition from the 1970s model to whatever the 21st century model will be. And one of the things SWEEP hopes to do is to guide that transition. But the overall purpose of SWEEP is to collect as much material as possible, process it in a way to maximize the quality of that product, and to identify and grow markets for those products, preferably markets that are closer to the source of generation than farther away. So we're really trying to have an emphasis on local markets and incentivize companies and governments to not only create local infrastructure, but also local markets. Our first credit in sustainable materials management has to do with a market-based waste management program. It has been shown that when you price materials according to both volume and composition, waste generation can go down. We do want people to begin examining the purchase decision and also make decisions to purchase materials with recycled content. And so there are a variety of market-based mechanisms that are incentivized in SWEEP, including extended producer responsibility. That is not mandated, but highly encouraged, as are pricing schemes and procurement incentives for materials that have been sourced from locally recovered materials and locally produced products. We talked about quantity and quality. The quantity part of sweep has to do with a minimum diversion rate. The more we divert, the more materials are available for recovery and processing and recirculation back into the economy. And a complement to that is an alternative compliance pathway for reducing diversion. And that gets not only to the recycling piece of it, but also the waste prevention and the reuse. So trying to build, clear customer decision-making for whether something needs to be purchased or what the nature of the packaging or the purchase decision is emphasized through education, public participation in the waste policy arena, and also creating incentives for developing local infrastructure for producing materials and then getting recovered materials to those producers. So if we look at the material recovery and per capita disposal optimization, again, that is seeking the highest possible diversion rate possible. We give increasing points for either higher diversion rates or lower per capita disposal rates, where you have, and one of the things that we're in the process of calculating is how do we deal with jurisdictions that have a high rate of visitation. And visitation could be people commuting in for work. It could be tourism, a lot of things that might, if you're looking at a per capita basis, might not necessarily be reflected in the annual population, but does, is represented in the amount of waste generated within that jurisdiction. So, we will be developing tools to carve those elements out so that, jurisdictions are not penalized there. But at the end of the day, we are looking at maximizing the amount of material recovered while also minimizing the amount of material disposed. And there are, a number of metrics that we encourage and sweep for that. If you want to download the standard, you can go to www.sweepstandard.org, and there is a pull down where you can download the standard and see what the specific requirements are. The quality element of it, we look at the the quality elements developed by ISRI and other trade associations for sort of minimum standard bale purity, and then we bump it up a little bit. So basically, our first tier of credit is if you reduce contamination in a standard bale by 10 to 15%. And then if you, at the second tier where you get 2 points, if you reduce it another 5 to 10%, again, depends on the commodity. And then finally, where you're reducing bale contamination by 30% or more, obviously that has front end costs, but also it has back end rewards. But the point is to try and really emphasize quality materials production and have people track the contamination both coming into the material recovery infrastructure as well as coming out, recording that because obviously you can't manage what you don't measure, but you can't measure what you haven't defined. And so one of the key aspects of sweep is to get definitions for variety, what constitutes contamination, what constitutes recoverable, et cetera. We will largely build on existing efforts to define these things, looking at examples from California, EPA, et cetera. We're going to try not to reinvent the wheel, but we will have a professional committee looking at this. As Professor Hulls mentioned earlier, if you are interested in getting involved with this or other committees, please drop us a note at info@sweepstandard.org. And these purity levels or certified quality extend to the organic materials. We look for STA certified compost being a major element of the the material that is produced in organics. We had a couple of questions coming up around the treatment and disposal of quote unquote compostable flatware, et cetera. And this is, I think, one of those things that in theory is better than in practice. I'm not aware of many high quality composters that accept large volumes of PLA and other supposedly biodegradable plastics. I think this was an idea that people thought was a good one at the time, but as we learn more and do more life cycle assessment, I think we're coming to realize that it may, in fact, even be worse than plastic in some situations. So, we have to recognize that there are a lot of things that we're learning, and we're trying some things. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And hopefully, during the investigation process and testing things in the field, SWEEP will help get increased clarity on this, more precise definition, clearer boundaries, et cetera. But looking at organic infrastructure, not from the yard waste, but also from the food waste perspective, is very important. I think as food processing facilities become more widespread and creating an effective and cost-effective supply chain to get food waste out of the waste stream, that will benefit the climate. And we just need to figure out how to do it cost effectively, because right now, most people are not interested in, they're even less interested in separating their food waste from everything than they are separating their single stream. And so, we may need to come up with a completely different way, maybe moving to a full mixed waste sorting type of system, and then, taking the food out on the back end rather than on the front end, or maybe utilizing the existing wastewater management infrastructure as a place to digest food rather than building standalone facilities, and figuring out, through incinerators, disposals, whatever you want to call them, as a means of getting the organics to those areas. And obviously, as a famous pundit once said, the cause of problems is solutions. So these ideas may not be applicable everywhere, and we're going to be trying to evaluate different options as we go, and picking the winners and putting them forward, and letting the losers fall by the wayside. And then finally, we're looking very closely at the compact, and by that I mean close in commodity and output supply chain. Having more modular, smaller units closer to sources of waste may overcome some of the logistical hurdles that larger, more centralized facilities represent. The question whether the economics can work or not is another issue. But obviously, for local economies, having the significant multipliers that the recycling industry brings in terms of jobs, in terms of taxes, in terms of indirect and induced jobs is definitely something that a good circular economy development strategy would want to emphasize, figuring out how to capture and repurpose the materials that are discarded as close to the source of generation as possible. And so, taking into account, the cost and emissions and environmental footprint of varying transportation modes, we look at incentivizing developing markets and supply chains closer to the source of waste as part of what this particular credit incentivizes. So I really appreciate your attention. John Michael and I would love to take your questions. It looks like we've got a fair amount of questions going. I think Will is going to help us work through some of those questions that have either come up during the Q&A or in the chat. So Will, what is our first question?
So for the most part, John Michael was able to answer the majority of them, but I would like to see your answers as well. So the first question that came in was, in my view, the long-term solution is mandating reverse supply chain, full producer responsibility, plus increasing considerably the price of landfilling for companies and consumers. What are the panelists' thoughts on this?
So clearly economics will be an important tool. That's kind of the foundation of the market mechanisms approach. Not surprisingly, when people pay more for materials, to dispose of materials, they throw out less. One of the unintended consequences is an increase in illegal dumping. So we cannot ignore that issue and find ways of, getting the good, which is decreased disposal, and minimizing the bad, which is the illegal dumping. We've also looked at trying to increase. Extended producer responsibility is absolutely one of the mechanisms that we reward. It's not the only one, because we recognize that it's a very, very complicated topic, and we need to know a lot more about it before we can sort of, definitively say that that's the way we want to go. But it's absolutely one of the things that we're looking at. We will be evaluating closely what those impacts are, and then beginning to emphasize those and other kinds of, whatever methods appear to work best are the ones that will be emphasized in subsequent iterations of the standard. John Michael, do you have anything to add?
One of the aspects of this is on the cost of landfilling, and I know that as landfill costs have increased in some areas, the amount of recycling has gone up. And I know from Southern California perspective, since I spent the majority of my time in Southern California, is that years ago, landfilling was prices were increasing dramatically, and one Southern California regional agency decided to get into the landfill business to develop landfills that would keep disposal costs low. And that sort of like worked against the purpose, I think, of allowing the markets to align, and that would have actually increasing costs of disposal would have actually allowed a lot of recycling to occur, because recycling is not something that's free. I mean, that's one of the big issues. When you said it's economy, yeah, it's economy, Rob. And if disposal's really cheap, it doesn't really take a look at the cost of extraction for many of the recyclable materials. So in order to prepare things for a market for someone to use, there's got to be an ability to somehow recover those costs of extraction, and right now that's just not happening. And so you could probably make a case about things like franchising and disposal costs and things of this nature, which could dramatically change, you might say, the market view.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So the next question came in, which is, what materials would you recommend for source separation, moving from single stream, for ease of sorting and reducing contamination?
I'm gonna let John Michael take that one first, and then I'll throw in my 2 cents.
When I take a look at around the world, because I did a lot of work, Neil Selvin and I did a lot of work with the World Bank and United Nations back in the 1970s and 80s. What we saw around the world was that most people didn't have the convenience of at-home or at-business pickup. If you wanted to get something recycled, you actually had to take it someplace. And I'm just it's interesting. For example, in Japan, people will separate into 45 different categories, and they have to personally take it down to the recycling center to get it done, to get something back into the marketplace. So, that kind of argues that our single stream is kind of a little bit backwards. We've actually gone from multiple streams of material. And in fact, when EPA first started talking about in the 1970s, multi-stream recycling, the idea was like keeping things sorted to a great extent. And over time, people started to, I would say businesses and agencies started to look at that and came up with a premise of like, well, let's commingle things. Let's make it easier. Let's expand the potential for people to participate. But that lowered the standards of what went into our recycling containers. So whether it was clearly cans, bottles, and newspaper became like everything. And today we see the issue come up of recycling.
I have a slightly different take. And 1972, my first job in middle school was helping people at the drop-off center in Tiburon, California, putting the right thing in the right bin. And honestly, there's frankly been quite little change in the structure since then. And it's my opinion that the mental model of the 1970s needs a complete revamp. The fact is that consumers suck at recycling. They either don't do enough or they do too much through wish cycling. And it's based on an antiquated notion that there is good garbage and bad garbage. If we take a different opinion that everything, and frankly, the recycling canon has very little, in some respects, doesn't have a lot to do with environmental impact. If you look at the tonnage and the environmental footprint of textiles compared to glass, for example, it's about 100 to 1. And we see almost no textile recovery outside of the volunteer drop-off at Goodwill. And yet we are talking about something that has probably 2 orders of magnitude of environmental impact compared to, glass. And so, the ton is not a great metric for, material evaluation. It's easy to measure. We've done it for a long time. We're comfortable with it. But one of the things that SWEEP wants to do is to create a different metric for what's important to collect. Climate is one of those metrics. Hopefully we'll get some folks using the life cycle assessment to MEB Calc and really do a deep dive into their waste stream and figure out, where the biggest bang for the environmental buck is, and then design their programs accordingly. Again, I think the 21st century approach would be to focus on the first 2 R's, which is what people are good at, and machines with density, dimension, and optical properties are a much better way of sorting and recovering materials. And if we rely on consumers to make that initial cut on what actually gets separated by density, dimension, optical properties, then we're literally eliminating 60 to 80% of our opportunity to get materials. So if we put everything into one bin, separate it all physically, then we can capture 100% of everything in the waste stream, and then have back-end technologies that will take that material and turn it into new products. And that's where I think things need to go in this century. And John Michael, you wanted to have a responsible alternative viewpoint, or?
Oh no, not at all. Those are really good points, Rob. I think one thing that has been an issue is that the waste stream changes over time. What people produce changes, and today the kind of complexities in the materials make it really difficult. I mean, we have so much that it would take 100 categories, to separate in. And I don't think that's really going to be possible. And even, an incredible amount of education is not necessarily going to help us to recycle aseptic packaging. Now, aseptic packaging, plastic, paper, and aluminum all laminated together, it's very complex and very expensive to take it apart. Not that any of those things in and of themselves couldn't be recycled, but that kind of shows the kind of complexities that we do see in our waste stream today. It is not the same as it was in the 1950s, nor even before then. But one thing that I know that in one question that we got at the very beginning of the presentation was about, like, well, maybe we should go back to just bottles and glass bottles and not have plastics and things. There's a lot of reasons why things happen and why packaging changes. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have more sustainable packaging, but we do need to understand why certain packages and certain things do happen within the economy. And when I think about even aseptic packaging around the world has decreased the amount of organic waste tremendously, because it's done under aseptic, antiseptic conditions, so that food can last a long time, much longer, because there isn't a plethora of refrigeration around the world. So actually, in some cases, a product that we might say, oh, horrible, bad, aseptic packaging, has been just a tremendous boon to the reduction of food waste and delivery of food to people, because of the fact that they don't have refrigeration.
And this is one area where you raised an excellent point. This is one area where extended producer responsibility, or compounding research in areas that maybe there are ways to create certain enzymatic keys to unlock the multi-layer packaging that can be designed into packages going forward, so that when they go into the waste stream, you sort of put the key into the thing and it unlocks the packaging. And my guess is that, given the advances in material science that are going on, that we'll probably see something like that. I mean, it's clearly something that the Carton Institute and other organizations are working hard on. Sustainable Packaging Coalition, which is one of our members of the steering committee. So we don't have a lot of ability to get on the dark side of the moon of that sort of back end of the sustainable materials management circle. We're sort of focused on the piece where it at end of life. We don't have a lot of say or a lot of leverage over the production, at least within the context of SWEEP and our certification of local governments and waste management industries. But hopefully, by bringing those perspectives into creating procurement standards and other kinds of elements that are also part of SWEEP, we can incentivize people to create these more designed for disassembly, if you will, types of aspects.
One thing also too, just to build on that, is that we're seeing that there are a variety of other mechanisms that can be brought into play. We don't put our electronics, in our recycling bin. We keep them sorted. We don't put our needles into recycling bins. We sort those separately. There's a whole variety of different products and materials that have different, you might say, pathways. I think one thing that's happened over the past decade that has had a major impact on both waste management as well as residuals management as well as recycling is confidential paper destruction. When I do lead analyses for places, and you look at the trash bin, you look at the recycling bin, and you do your diversion analysis, it's like, well, where's the recycling going on? Well, it's actually going on inside, because there's a whole different company that's got locked carts inside a building, and people are putting their confidential papers in that, and it's headed out a completely different door. And so there is all kinds of opportunities, as long as there is a pricing economic mechanism for it. Things will get done, because virtually all confidential papers are recycled.
I think we
And
need
that was the
vanishing
one
ink.
thing. Yeah. So, I mean, there's other things that can happen that we need to consider. So we don't have to put it all in one, but there has to be a really good reason why we're going to divert into different streams, because, it is going to be an educational issue, and we're going to have to require more of people to do much more. And even some things in which they're going to take responsibility for themselves, like put your organics, if you got a backyard, put your organics in the backyard and compost it. If you got a lawn and you're not using it as a ball field, like maybe consider grass cycling or an organic garden or something of that nature. And so I think there's what I'm getting at is that there's a multitude of solutions, but it really has to take a kind of a look, and communities, if they're still responsible for the management of these residuals in their community, and it's not just simply a EPR decision, then there has to be some understanding of this and be able to give the right information, right signals, and provide you might say, the educational tools and other aspects that will enable people to do the right job.
And just again, there's a lot of inefficiency in the markets right now. The P&G has developed a couple of amazing technologies to recycle diapers, for example. It's done commercially in Italy because they already had an infrastructure doing that. What are we going to do here? We're going to have guys on bicycles going door to door and picking up diapers and bringing them to a facility. What kind of waste shed is that going to work on, right? So, the components of diapers, the cellulose, the plastic, and in particular the superabsorbent polymer are individually and once separated really valuable, but collecting that material and getting it to a centralized facility, unless you were doing mixed waste solution, because that has access to everything, you can't get that. Similarly, they've done their pure cycle technology to eliminate dyes from polypropylene. They have to import carpet from California by rail in order to get enough polypropylene to make their factory work. Okay, so there are clear problems with the markets and our ability to collect and get materials where they need to go. There are a ton of technologies sitting on the shelf that can unlock the potential of each of these materials, if only we get enough quality. And that's why I think a centralized mixed waste situation where you separate everything physically gives you the ability to unlock that economic value across the entire chain of materials.
One last aspect is actually different, a little bit different perspective from the marketer or from the end user's perspective, is like, what are you really looking at? When we think of recycling from the consumer end, we're thinking, like cans, papers, bottles, and so it's a very simple view. But from the end user, there's actually hundreds of grades of paper. There are literally thousands of polymer type resins, and each of these things are, they change over time. Wood fiber degrades every time it's recycled. There's a maximum extent to which it can be recycled. So mixing everything together, that tends to put it down into, you might say, the lowest economic level. If you do mix it all together, if someone wants to use that as is and does not do the sorting, the grading, the beneficiation, then that kind of limits exactly what we can do with stuff. And we see that with a lot of plastics, taking plastics and making carb, stanchions, just so people don't run into a wall or something, or some other very low grade uses. And those things don't generate much value, for communities. And that kind of has to be taken a look at, that a lot of stuff will not end up back in the primary industries or in the secondary materials industries. We may actually have to look at developing brand new industries at a local level, and be able to find brand new uses for some of the materials. But if we put it all on consumers, I don't think that's quite fair. We put it on cities, that's not quite fair. It's got to be a question right from the get-go. And that's where we don't have a sustainable materials management policy in the country. And it's sort of like Wild West in terms of production of a lot of products. We don't look at synergistic effects for different types of substances and such. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. You might say upstream or on the front end.
But just before we wrap, I know we're bumping up, if not a little bit over time. Appreciate everybody's. There were a couple questions about compostables, and this is just sort of just right now. There's a gap between theory and practice. In theory, these plastics should be compostable. In practice, they don't really fit in. Some of them take 60 to 70 days to decompose, whereas depending upon what kind of composting technology you're using, you're looking at 30 to 45 days. Does it make sense to, continue working on the chemistry, maybe set up an alternative composting pathway for these things? Maybe. But like I said, it's just one of those things where things should work, but in practice, they don't. And then, part of the problem with relying on consumers, a couple of questions about, talking about the difficulty handling recycling when certain commodities are more profitable than others, and then the disparate, prices for fibers. There's sort of like this almost self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Consumers do a bad job recycling, either they're doing too much or too little. And that makes the quantity and quality of materials highly volatile. It makes markets in terms of commodity prices highly volatile. When prices are highly volatile, investors are not willing to invest in upgraded materials to handle and sort those things with, to quality standards that are being demanded by the market. So the underinvestment leads to contamination. It leads to low quality materials, which again, or highly variable quality of materials, which again leads to the volatility. So all of these things, I think, are inherent in the structure of the system, which started in the 1970s, hasn't changed much, relying on consumers to be that first gatekeeper to materials into the industry. I think that needs to change if we're going to do that radical change that the vast majority of people who responded to the poll question at the beginning said that we needed.